Happy Lamster, Radlev.
Happy Lamster.
So, what can the right wing teach Christians?
Right. Okay. So something I think about a lot is that saying from Jesus where he says we should be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. Right. And my feeling is that Christians have maybe been stronger on the gentle as dove parts and a little weaker on the wise as serpents part.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Yeah. And so having said that, I'm not going to be vague here. I want to be specific about what I think. So some wisdom that Christians can learn, the church can learn from the right wing. And I don't think it's that complicated, right? It's the dangers of the left. I mean, if you want to learn something from the right wing, how about the dangers of the left? Okay, but let me be really specific about this, and I want to make this in a way that I think Christians can understand this insight of the right in a Christian context, in a theological context. All right. So, what is the big thing we learn on the right, as our friend Academic Agent emphasizes? Robert Conquest's second law, right? Any organization not explicitly and constitutionally right wing will sooner or later become left wing, and we have watched this happen, right? So we've seen the left take over secular institutions, but also churches. Actually, I like the wider shot because then you see the chickens with.
Oh, perfect! Look at that.
Those are chickens. Our chickens. Bruce.
Amazing.
Anyway, not a live shot, but
very well behaved chickens.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have watched the marvelous skill of left wingers to take over secular institutions. Speaking quickly from the conservative perspective, we have seen neoconservatives, which Paul Gottfried and I and others would argue are essentially leftists, who masquerade as conservatives. Neoconservatives have taken over all the conservative institutions. They basically grabbed all the money, where conservative right-wing folks from the past had left money to fund conservative institutions and so forth. It all got taken over by neocons. We lost it all and had to start over from scratch. And so we've seen how effective they are at taking over organizations. Here's the scary part, I think, for Christians, and here's where I think Christians should have some humility and try to learn from the right wing. We've also seen it happen in the churches. Let's be blunt, right? I mean, the Pope is a commie, right? I mean, to not beat around the bush.
No, but two finer points on it.
Yeah, exactly. But not just that. I think Luke, as well as I, that in evangelical circles, Reformed circles, etc., we have this problem. There was the great stream this week with the Ortho Bros, right? Where they were talking about a metropolitan who they think is just completely compromised. And so, this is a big problem. It's not just a problem in secular institutions. It's not just a problem for universities. We all talk about political correctness in the universities. It's a problem in. So here's how I think about this. As we know, Christianity has a great track record of synthesizing with various cultures, right? Sometimes it can go off the rails and become like syncretism in the bad sense, right? But at its best, we see what we see in Europe, where pagan themes in Europe are woven into the European understanding of Christianity in a way that does not, at its best, nullify Christianity or is heretical or anything like that, but builds on truths that were already there in the culture, right? And so Christianity has a great track record of doing that. And my guess is, over the last century or two, Christians have figured, well, we'll just do the same with the left. We'll integrate some emphasis on worker rights. I'm going back a little bit to classical Marxism there. We'll integrate some emphasis on worker rights. We'll criticize capitalism. I'm thinking of some papal encyclicals starting in the 19th century, for example. More recently, we'll dash a little bit of anti-racism in there, right?
Yeah.
And once again, Christianity will take the best, leave the rest, and soldier on, right? But that's not what we're seeing happen. The left has not leftist themes have not seemed to be able to be reconciled with Christianity in the way that English culture has been reconciled with Christianity, such that now we can't extricate them anymore, and they seem very tightly bound, right? Instead, the bringing in the left has acted like an acid on orthodoxy, right? So whatever you think of the left in other regards, if you just think about it theologically as a Christian, the left comes in and long-held Christian principles start to get tossed overboard, right? So they literally are an acid to orthodoxy. So
why is it
the heck is going on? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So why is it that the attempted integration of the left has not worked in the way that integrating previous cultures has?
Okay, so I want to turn to a fellow who I want to bring to the attention of the right and my Christian friends. He was a martyr under the Chinese communists, and his name was Watchman Nee. He was a big favorite of my father's. Have lots of great books, and the one I want to bring up is Spiritual Authority, and this has got to be the most right-wing Christian theology book I know of. Like, I'm thinking of all my far-right friends, and I'm imagining them reading this going like, whoa, dude, chill. Like, this is a really intense book about the principle of authority.
You've got my attention.
Yeah, the divine principle of authority. Okay, so here's one way to think about this using the authority lens. As you all may know, despite many of my right-wing friends not liking it, I try to harmonize traditionalism or conservatism and libertarian concerns for justice. Okay, so here's how I think about it from the point of view of authority. The golden mean, the Aristotelian golden mean. So traditionalists teach us that neglect by proper authority is an abuse, right? That we need authority and it needs to fulfill its function. Or, like in the family, you have chaos in the family because the father is not being a father, for example, right? You have chaos in the church because the leader of the church is not assuming his position, disciplining when it needs to be done, giving a vision to the people, all those things, right? That is, traditionalists and conservatives tend to understand the significance of authority and its importance, and that it is wrong. It's an abuse when you are neglectful, right? Think of, in the context of the family, think of a parents who neglect their children, right? They don't see to their needs, physical needs, but emotional and spiritual needs, right? And of course, we know of all the pathologies that come from the broken down family and children getting involved in drugs and all those, right? The traditionalist looks at this and says, this is where proper parental authority has fallen down. And now we're seeing the bitter fruit of that, right? So that's the traditionalist emphasis. It's extremely important. But I would say that's sort of one side. I'm going a little Jordan Peterson here for a moment. Libertarians give us the other side, which is that when authority goes beyond the bounds of justice, it becomes tyranny. And of course, that's also an abuse, right?
It makes me think of Kuyper's sphere sovereignty, the idea that there are realms in which there is a proper order, and that it's wrong to assume authority over the natural. So, like you mentioned, in a family, there's a natural order where the head is the father. If the family is subverted by the state coming in and usurping the father's authority, then that's broken a right ordering in the universe.
Right, and that's tyranny, right?
Yes.
Or in the corporate world, we call it micromanagement.
Yes, good link.
which is associated with something that we get very frustrated with, right?
That's interesting. That sort of continues a thought that I slightly stalled on when I was talking to Charlemagne last night, because we were thinking about this question of it within a project. How come there's some trade-off between you don't want to micromanage all of the people and tell them in precise every detail what they do in their working day. You need to give them some flexibility and freedom. But at some point, their insistence on freedom and requiring other people to support them in their sort of esoteric programming techniques starts to cause trouble for everybody else.
Right. So there's a balance.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, let's use the workplace real quick to finish up getting a picture of this balance in our minds. How do you fail from a traditionalist perspective? It's when, as Scott Adams pointed out, the biggest complaint about bosses is actually not that they micromanage, believe it or not, because they've done all these polls and stuff. It is that it's the boss who won't deal with the problem employee.
Interesting.
They won't take authority and get the dysfunctional person in line or fire them, or and the whole organization is getting twisted out of shape trying to work around this one person who is bizarre, sick, or whatever, and the person won't take their authority. So it's kind of unexpected, right? You'd think
that is unexpected.
Bitch about the boss being bossy. No, they bitch about the boss not being a boss.
They don't need the boss to make all the decisions. They need the boss to make the hard decisions.
The hard decisions, exactly. Yeah. Right. So in other words, how do you fail as a boss? On the one hand, you micromanage. Right. You get into the details of stuff that you need to trust your people to do. You need to get good people, let them do their work, and support them. Right. The other way to fall off the horse on the other side, is to not be a leader, not take care of the hard decisions that are your proper role. Right. And your team's looking to you. Your team is looking to you to take care of business. Right. Okay. So having said all that, my contention, and it probably seems radical, except among my right-wing friends, and so that's why it's so nice to be in this context to say this. Anywhere else in our world, this sounds like insanity, right? My contention is that leftism, which I understand primarily as egalitarianism, does not bring a helpful balancing perspective. Okay. I think that the traditionalist emphasis on proper authority and the libertarian emphasis on justice, that you ought not to go beyond your authority, right? That's an abuse. To avoid those two abuses, that is what you need. That is what you need for politics. That's what you need to be a good parent, in terms of being an authority, and so on and so forth. You do not need egalitarianism. In fact, I'm going to go further. I think that they bring a sort of heresy to the table, and that is why they don't mix with Christianity. In fact, I'm going to go building off Watchman Nee here. I'm going to argue that in a way it's sort of worse than what we usually think of as a heresy.
Wow.
Okay, because I think we usually think of a heresy. The classic definition is you take like one truth and push it too far. Right? You take like something that's there in the scriptures, for example, and you like overemphasize it. Yeah, you overemphasize it to the detriment of other things that are true. Right? But egalitarianism, I think, is fundamentally just a falsity. It's not bringing a grain of truth. It's just wrong. Okay. That is, I'm being radical today. Egalitarianism.
You are radical liberation.
That's right. Egalitarianism is literally Satanism. Now, why do I say that? Because what did Satan say? The scriptures tell us. He didn't say that he wanted to be higher than God. He said he wanted to be like the Most High. Right? He wanted to be equal to God.
Oh, so wow.
People think of the satanic principle, and they, he's Satan. He's like Hitler. He wants to be in charge of everything. Right?
No,
that's sort of
he wants God and Satan to be on the same level.
Yes.
I'd never thought of that, but that makes 100% sense.
Right. Okay. So let me bring a little more theology into this, courtesy of a non-Christian. Who I've learned many things from, even about Christianity, and that's Murray Rothbard. He, in his study of Karl Marx, who, by the way, wrote satanic poems when he was young, so that's interesting. But that's a whole rabbit hole. whole rabbit hole. Marx and Satan by the Lutheran Richard Wurmbrand would be my recommendation if you find that interesting. Okay, Murray Rothbard talked about creatology, and here's what he saw in the leftist or the egalitarian stream. He saw a heretical view of the creation, and it goes like this. The orthodox view of creation, that is, why did God make anything beside himself? Like, why didn't God just sit there and be himself, right? Well, there's two ways that you can look at it. The Orthodox Christian view is that out of the fullness of his love, he created, the angels and people and humans and so forth, right? So out of his abundance, you might say, he created us, not because he was incomplete. There wasn't like a defect in God and he needed to make us so that he could be complete, right? It's out of his abundance, out of his love. For the reason you might have children, say, if you're a healthy, balanced person, you're not creating those children because you need them, right? That's a recipe for dysfunction. You're going to live through your children and all that stuff. No. You have God's love. You love your wife. You love each other. Out of that fullness and abundance, your cup overfloweth. Come children, who you're able to love and love them as a blessing and as a gift and as a grace, right? So this is sort of a picture of God's love in creating us, right? The alternative view, the leftist view, is that God created out of incompleteness. And alienation, fundamentally, Marxist alienation actually goes back to a theological perspective, which is that we are alienated from God. We're meant to all be like together, but we're separated. Not in the usual Christian sense we think of through sin. We're separated because we're different beings. Okay. And so what you see with egalitarianism is that the future they're looking towards is not the Christian future, which is that, we continue to be ourselves and be just more, through God in heaven, we become more completely ourselves, right? He enables us to be more like who we were meant to be all along. In this view, in the alienation view, you come together and become one. You also, I think, might see this in some Eastern philosophy, right? And Rothbard, in his usual funny way, talks about the blob. What you see in these perspectives is that someday we're going to solve all this alienation and we're going to be back together in one big undifferentiated blob. Okay, now hopefully this is starting to sound very familiar from the sort of diversity, the gospel of diversity, right? Yes. The differences are offensive to them. Yeah. That there should be separate peoples who are distinct and remain distinct through time, right? This really bugs them. No. We need to have mass immigration. We need to mix everybody up. Well, what's the point of that? It's so that we'll be the same. It comes back to this again. It's this egalitarianism, right? We want the sameness. But that is not the Christian view. The Christian view is that we ought to be different. We become like Christ and so forth, but we don't become like Christ by losing ourselves, but by fulfilling what God made us to be, right? The saint is not more generic. He's more sharp and distinct, more himself than the sinner, who is more like a shadow of who he was meant to be, right?
I was just wondering, because I've often thought of the left instinct that we currently see as a Christian heresy. And as you say, Christian heresies are usually a seed of truth that's kind of pushed to a ridiculous degree. I wonder if the kinds of ideas within Christianity which have gone sort of cancerous might be things like, so Jesus, who is the teacher, the one who is who has followers, who's called rabbi, and yet he washes the feet of his disciples. So there's this kind of radical inversion of the hierarchy, where
Mm-hmm.
and like in Ephesians 5, submit to one another, or the verses that talk about there is no male nor female. So I want to give you the chance to answer back to, I think, what would be the leftist kind of theological take, that doesn't the Bible just tell us that everybody should be 100% equal? Like all of the hierarchy of kings above people, or husbands above families, was all part of the fall, and actually Jesus turned it all on its head.
Right. Well, Jesus demonstrates this in his own life, right? Because you can't get more fundamental than the Godhead itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if the egalitarian principle is wrong within the Godhead, then it's just wrong all over the place. And what do we see in Jesus's ministry? He's constantly showing submission to the Father.
Yes.
I wish I had a gazillion verses at hand, but
well, we're gonna we get, as you might at the end of all of these streams through Lamster, I'm reading a little passage from the Passion narratives, and so we've seen Jesus in the garden praying, if there's any way that this cup could be taken from me, then please, I don't want to go to the cross, yet not my will but yours.
Not my will but thine be done. Exactly. Wonderful example of the kind of submission I have in mind. But you see it throughout his ministry.
So
he keeps sort of pointing to the Father. So that is, as far as I can tell, there's not even egalitarianism within the Godhead, within the Trinity.
Right. Which is kind of a mind-blowing thing, right? You've got and actually I think there's something kind of intuitive about that somehow when I started hearing these ideas from the pulpits about, the Trinity was just a sort of mutual submission, and three equal beings, and then almost the concept being that then the reason the earth was created was so that God could add a fourth element and kind of complete, mankind as part of this. And you go like, this seems, and now that you've made that connection with like the pride of Satan, I really think this is a very powerful and dangerous heresy that people have twisted the Christian message to say not that God reaches down and generously blesses us, but that we had the right to be equal with God from the beginning, and we're kind of reclaiming what we ought to have had, because aren't we worth it? Aren't we?
Right. Yeah. So I want to move on to our other side here. Just to wrap this up, what can the right wing teach Christianity? I think, especially when you take it in and really think about it from a Christian theological perspective deeply, read your Watchman Nee, Spiritual Authority. I think the message from the wisdom the right wing has for Christianity is stop trying to reconcile yourself with egalitarianism. Spit it out. It's not something that's helping the church. It's an acid to orthodoxy. It's distorting the church, and we need to reject it. Okay?
So, what can the right wing learn from Christians?
Right. Okay, so two things I want to get into very briefly. One, in a way, it's much smaller than the exalted stuff we were just talking about. It's that Christianity was a successful dissident movement, and I really think, in a lot of ways, with apologies to my dear pagan friends, I think that it makes a lot more sense to look at Christianity as a dissident movement and draw lessons from it than what we often do. And I'm not saying you can't learn anything this way, but we often look at left-wing revolutions and talk about Leninism
Yeah.
Leninist tactics and the vanguard and so on and so forth. Glad to learn what we can learn, take the best, right? But let's face it, what they built didn't last. Whereas the church built something that's, we're going on 2,000 years here, right? So I think right-wingers right-wingers are not as excited about, let's just smash everything and then dance in the ashes, right? Have a rave in the ashes. That's not the right-wing way. I think for right-wingers or conservatives, we want to build things that last. We want to build solidly, and we want to create and construct.
In some ways, if you're wanting to learn how to build a beautiful building, and you say, well, let's go and look at the people who demolished this other building, because they were really effective at demolishing stuff. Right?
Yeah,
they completed their objectives. They got everything done they needed to. So we can probably apply their approaches to our objectives, right?
Right. And on the destruction part, maybe you can learn something. But
yeah,
we want to create ultimately. They can't bring us all the way. Let's put it that way, right? So another book recommendation. Let's see if I can actually. Yeah, there we go. So this is called The Rise of Christianity by Rodney Stark, a fascinating figure, a sociologist who writes a lot about church history and things like that, and brings a fresh perspective on these things. In case the relevance of this book isn't obvious, let me read you the lengthy subtitle, the subhead for this, right on the cover of the book: How the Obscure, Marginal Jesus Movement Became the Dominant Religious Force in the Western World in a Few Centuries. So he just steps back and goes, okay, wow. They went from, Jesus and the disciples and a few other people or whatever, right, to the following, okay? He right at the beginning of the book, he tries to drive home how remarkable those first 300 years are. This is from Rise of Christianity by Stark. Attempts by the Emperor Diocletian in 303. Let me say that again. The year 303. That is really early, okay? Attempts by Diocletian in 303, continued by his successor Galerius in 305, to use persecution to force Christians to support the state had failed, because by the year 300, Christianity had become too widely accepted in Roman society to make a successful persecution on the part of the government. So as a result, by 311, Galerius switched tactics and excused the Christians from praying to Roman gods and asked only that they pray to their own God for our security and that of the state. And thus Constantine's Edict of Toleration, issued 2 years later, was simply a continuation of state policy. So basically, they gave up bringing the Christians to heel because 300 years after the birth of Christ, the game was over. Okay.
Wow.
That is really remarkable. Now, I am not going to try to summarize that whole story here. I recommend The Rise of Christianity to you. In everything I'm saying today, my intention is to prod you and get you to dig into these things and let's all think together. But let me give you a little taste of how Christianity grew that might feel kind of relevant somehow. Let's see if you can stretch your imagination. How did the early church grow through plagues? Okay,
is there anything that's happened recently that's plague-like?
Exactly. Yeah. Stretch your imagination with me. Okay.
Well, I'll leave that as an exercise for the viewer.
So, what happened is, I'll give you a little quote from the Dionysus, the Christian Dionysus, to give a sense of this. But here's basically what happened. The plague would come along. Okay, no. I'll say that. Okay, so what would happen during a plague? The pagans would run for the hills and say, looks like everybody's getting sick. I'm getting out of here. Okay. The Christians would nurse the sick. Their own, of course, because you take care of your own, right? Their family and their fellow believers. But then also they would care for some non-Christians as well, who were too sick to head to the hills or whatever. So listen to Dionysus's testimony at the height of the second great epidemic around 260. Most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy. For they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. The best of our brothers lost their lives in this manner. A number of presbyters, deacons, and laymen winning high commendation, so the death in this form, the result of great piety and strong faith, seems in every way the equal of martyrdom. So, instead of running, Christians cared for people. What were the results of this? Well, here's what someone points out. When all normal services break down, quite elementary nursing will greatly reduce mortality. Simple provision of food and water, for instance, will allow persons who are temporarily too weak to cope for themselves to recover instead of perishing miserably. So what was the result? The plague, the epidemic would come through, Christians would stay, and some of them would die, as Dionysius argued, martyrs' deaths, caring for those who were sick, knowing that it might result in their own death, which it often did. But when the plague was over, more of the people that the Christians had cared for lived because elementary nursing was so effective, right? Just basically providing for people's basic needs. And I think we saw some of this recently where there's allegations, well, hopefully someday we'll know the truth of it. There's allegations that some people died because they were just like, they're sick, just stop giving them normal care, you know? So anyway, after the epidemic's over, what happens? More Christians are alive because Christians were caring for Christians. And non-Christians, pagans, who were cared for were more likely to survive. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say they were likely to become Christians after going through that experience. You know, everybody else left me alone, abandoned me, and I was just going to starve to death, basically. If the plague didn't get me, I was going to starve to death because I was weak, right? But the Christians cared for me. I want to be with those folks. Okay.
So I was just wondering, one of the reasons that Christianity was so successful was because it was potentially supernaturally aided by God. But I suppose if we're giving a message to people who are Christians within the right, they don't need to know why they should learn lessons from Christianity because they're Christians.
Right.
And if we're giving a message what non-Christians within the right should learn from Christianity, then they don't believe that God was involved, so they should pay attention. So it's kind of like either way, it's a subject worth paying attention to, because either it's true and therefore it's important because it's God's word, or it's not true and it's just the single greatest cause of order and great civilization in the last 2,000 years that sprung up seemingly miraculously. So the headline there is that Christian morality, far from being weak, is actually strong.
If you're thinking the way that a lot of us are thinking at this time, you're thinking about sort of movement growth, right? You know, you've got a dissident movement, and you want that movement to flourish. Then you have a lot to learn from early Christianity. That individual members would be martyred, would die because of caring for sick people during epidemic, et cetera, et cetera. But overall, the movement kept growing, right? So as Dionysius suggests, the death of these Christians was not empty or meaningless. It brought forth life. Literally, in this case, in a very simple way, they literally just helped people stay alive who would have died without their care. Their death brought forth life in that way, and it brought life to the church. The blood of the martyr is the seed of the church, right? Which is an
incredibly fitting example for Easter, as Faith is pointing out, that Jesus died and brought life. In the same way, the followers of Jesus who either suffered or even went the full way and were martyred, they that sacrifice spurred on the. I always think it's quite funny that one of the critiques of paganism is that Christianity is kind of timid and will be wiped out. But the evidence is quite the opposite. I mean, Christianity has only increased in the last 2,000 years as a percentage of the world population. It's actually it's continuing to increase.
Yes.
So it is.
Yeah, and I'm reading this book, The Next Christendom by Philip Jenkins, where he's talking about the growth of the church in Africa and so on and so forth. You know, basically the next stage, right? Where we thought of it as a very European, and at this point, Europeans are by far a minority in the world church, right? So the church continues to grow. So you know, you can be upset with that for various reasons because you only care about Europe or something, or you could learn from it. You could learn from the church. How did it grow, right? So
that was one. You said there was two things.
Yeah, one final point, and again, I feel like it's so simple. I'm almost embarrassed to point it out, but you know, the perennialists and so forth are saying that. You could say one very simple thing from them is that they are against a reductionist, materialist view of life, right? There's something blinkered about that, and so the perennialist, even if they wouldn't agree with Christians on some things, they would share a disdain for like the new atheist, right? Who's just seems very, very narrowed and kind of blinkered in their view of life. You know, they don't see the power of myth. They don't see things that are higher or spiritual. And I know people mean various things by spiritual, right? But we have a sense that we refer to something that's a little bit beyond sort of crass, short-term material concerns, right? So I see a lot of people who are frankly Darwinist in their perspective in the right wing. They're focused on the survival of their people, or maybe if they're being generous, just the survival of humanity, which sometimes feels like dodgy lately. But anyway, they're focused on the survival of their people. But I think ultimately that is not a good enough vision. That is not powerful enough. Without a vision, the people perish, right? And so what I think Christianity brings to the table is that higher spirituality that perennialists are looking for. And then, of course, with Christ, as Lewis and Tolkien taught us, we see myth and history meeting in the person of Christ, right? There's all these myths of the dying God, the God who sacrifices himself, Odin hanging on a tree, so on and so forth, you know. And it all becomes reality, a history, with a man who actually walked on the earth and had dirt on his feet and so forth, right? And so that ultimate end, you know, I think we're going to run out of gas a little while. I do not disdain the concern for, you know, white people being abused and Europeans being abused and all those things, and the concern that this people continue, you know, and not be destroyed. I do not disdain that, but I think ultimately you need something. You need a stronger vision. You need a spiritual vision, and merely biological propagation, I don't think is going to cut it in the end. It's just, it doesn't call to our hearts quite as strongly as what we need. And Christianity has that higher call, that exalted vision, right?
It seems to be something that's being acknowledged even by people outside the right wing, but I think it should be a very natural thing for the right to agree. But one way or another, I think there's been been a strong kickback happening to the. I mean, New Atheism in some ways was like a resurgence of the extreme spirit of enlightenment. Like we can build from a sort of ex nihilo, all of the philosophy and culture and just as out of our brains, and forget all culture and tradition, and like it's all superstition nonsense, and we can throw it out, and just the strong evidence on multiple levels is that's nonsense, and kind of laughable nonsense as well. Actually, that isn't how humans work, and I think that's interesting even within a materialist frame to say, well, pragmatically, we're going to have to pretend to ourselves that there is this greater narrative in existence than scientific truth.
Yeah, I just saw Starkey. What's his first name?
David.
David Starkey. Yeah, I just saw him talking about why he became a conservative, and he said, I'm still an atheist, but I realized there does need to be like something higher. It's really
he's been using a lot of biblical quotes in his videos recently, hasn't he? He keeps saying things like as so often Jesus gets it right when he says. It's like, yeah, interesting.
We'll have to pray for Brother Starkey there.
Well, quite. He's already made some significant ideological moves, somewhat, beyond his adolescence, which is an unusual thing to do. So, and I think, as well as it being an observation that the committed atheist can make in a detached way and say, well, my project of convincing everyone of atheism might be a bit sort of a bit of a foot gun, as they say. But actually, I think it points to something deeper, which is an actual flaw in the positivist epistemology. Like, oh, there's something that we're not accounting for here. You would predict, if humans were nothing but biological machines, that we could hack the system. And it appears that you can't lie, you can't fake it, and you can't ignore spirituality. And I think everybody struggles with the word spirituality because it points to something that is more ancient than the language that we've been handed by like the last couple of generations. The kind of jaded post-war,
Well, I love this observation from Paul Johnson. I read his History of the 20th Century. I mentioned this recently, but read his History of the 20th Century, and he's going through, World War I, World War II, all the usual stuff. And then he gets to the end and he says, what was the big surprise of the 20th century, at least to some people? That religion didn't die. That it was everybody predicted, with the growth of technology and our knowledge and our globalization and everything, religion will wither and we'll all become. It was the secularization hypothesis. Wow. It was even. I think it was even still strong when I was young, but certainly in like the 1950s. That's sort of what I think of as the height of atheism in the university and culture. At that point, there were people who they were counting. They expected it. They could see it coming, right? And it didn't at all. In fact, what Paul Johnson says, far from dying, religion is back, baby, in a huge way. And the communist regimes have fallen. The atheist communist regimes, right? The atheist regimes have all fallen.
Yes.
I mean, the only ones we have left are like North Korea. And how do people characterize North Korea? They say, honestly, it's more of a religion than communism. It's more of like the religion of that family, the trinity of that family, right? So everybody's religious at this point.
Wow. That really is another thing that the right can learn from Christianity, because how many times have we been told, the Manhattan will be underwater by 2015, or like, here's a sign on this glacier that says this won't be here in 10 years, and then they have to get rid of the sign. What's another prediction that we kept getting told was that religion was going to disappear, and yet the Bible said, nations rise and fall, but the word of God stands forever. So however you want to understand that, there is something. I think a lot of people are grappling with it in a Petersonian way. Maybe Peterson is becoming a meme, but maybe the forces that are trying to discredit him as an individual for his foibles in some ways are just another grasp at the hearts of men to say, like, ignore this glimmer of spirituality that you were starting to get interested in.
Don't look at the man behind the curtain.
Yeah, exactly. Like, a lot of the things that sparked interest in Peterson were not his political thinking, but were it was his biblical lectures. Stuff. Who'd have thought, right? I mean, what else can the right learn from Christianity than that you can hack the YouTube algorithm by talking about the Bible? or whatever collection of things led to that. You know, you probably do have to disentangle it, but one way or another, yes, the fates of these two groups, which I think I'd characterize myself as being within, are bound together in a,
I think so, yeah,
probably fundamentally truth-seeking way. I think this might be the tie that binds.
So I want to wrap up with an extremely relevant shill, okay? And that is that my wife and I are now on a rhythm of doing a Mrs. Radlib stream once a month, okay?
Amazing.
And this is great because she's working on notes for the next one after we finish the one before, you know? So, we're having conversations regularly. Our number one fan happens to be Luke right here, I think. He's probably the one who's...
They call them stands these days, right? I'm the I was raving. The first stream that happened, I was binge watching it over and over and telling everyone about it. And
thank you.
So I'm so excited. Yes.
So not only is Luke our I'm your number one fan, right? Anyway,
I should have a T-shirt and all the merch.
Not only is Luke our number one fan, I think, but also I asked him to host the Mrs. Radlib channel on his Discord, so where people can talk to her in between streams about the topics we've raised. So I'm happy to exclusively on Lambda's channel here reveal what's coming next, and it relates to one of the themes we talked about today. And that is the theme of proper spiritual authority. And we're going to go right to the heart of something that is not only a challenge in our culture, but has been a real area of growth within our marriage. And that is authority and submission between husband and wife.
Oh, this is going to be such a good stream. Yes.
This is a hot one.
Book when the date and time drops for that, everybody just book off whatever you're doing. You know, delay your wedding, or it's not as important as catching this stream. So that's super exciting. Okay. Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this, and I can only apologize to my audience that this one has to be a little bit shorter. But I will finish now by reading a passage from one of the Gospels. And Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said unto them, Ye brought unto me this man, as one that perverteth the people. And behold, I, having examined him before you, found no fault in this man, touching these things whereof you accuse him. No, not yet Herod, for he sent him back unto us, and behold, nothing worthy of death hath been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. Now, he must needs release unto them at the feast one prisoner. But they all cried out together, saying, Away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas, one who for a certain insurrection made in the city, and for murder, was cast into prison. And Pilate spake unto them again, desiring to release Jesus. But they shouted, saying, Crucify, crucify him. And he said unto them the third time, Why, what evil hath this man done? I have found no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. But they were urgent with loud voices, asking that he might be crucified. And their voices prevailed.